2014, voters in Scotland rejected separation from the Union back then. It feels like a lifetime ago. Indeed, the demand for a referendum on independence in Scotland is back with a vengeance. The SNP has won a majority of Scotland's seats in the House of Commons since then, and support for separation has grown since Brexit and the pandemic. If the SNP win a majority in Holyrood this year, Nicola Sturgeon has said she'll demand a new referendum against the wishes of the UK government, setting the scene for a constitutional showdown. The union in its current form is strained and in danger of fracturing. But separation isn't inevitable. And how can we keep the union together? We've got a great panel of speakers here. Scottish Shadow Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Murdo Fraser, who incidentally wrote a paper for Bright Blue a few years ago with a solution, which is a kind of quasi-federal settlement for the union, which might include, for example, UK-wide Senate and UK Council of Ministers. We have the news editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill, and the Liberal Democrat Treasury spokesperson, Christine Jardine, MP. If you're on Twitter, please use the hashtag BrightBlueTV. And as we're not in person, sadly, you have to ask questions through Slido, and the link to that is on YouTube. And you can see the code that you use, BrightBlueTV, if you want to ask a question. I will then field them to the speakers. So let's get cracking. So Murdo, what do you think are the reasons for this rise in separatism that we're seeing, the support for the right for separatism?
Well, the first thing to say is I don't think unionists should panic around the change in opinion polls. In fact, the two most recent polls that came out this year, one from Panel Base and one from Survation, actually shows a decline in support for separation, but it's still above the 50% mark, and that should concern us. So what's behind it? I think if you look at the analysis that's been done, it is very closely tied to people's perception of the performance of the Scottish government in relation to the COVID pandemic relative to the performance of the UK government, and in particular to the relative performance of Nicola Sturgeon as an individual as against Boris Johnson. Now, the reality is, and the frustration is for many pro-union politicians in Scotland, is that that perception is not, in fact, underpinned by the reality, because in reality, there's not been much better performance in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK, but the perception is that Nicola Sturgeon has handled this better and she's a better communicator. What does it mean longer term? Well, I think it means the pro-union camp has to be better at winning the arguments, in particular at winning the emotional and identity arguments for the UK. The panel-based poll that was in the Sunday Times at the weekend said that by a factor of 2 to 1, people in Scotland believe that independence would make them poorer. So we are winning the economic and financial argument hands down, but we're not winning the argument on emotion and on identity, and that's where the real challenge lies.
Okay, so Henry, I mean, everyone sort of draws parallels with Brexit, and yes, during the campaign, many factors were involved why it went for leave. But, you know, a lot of people say this was years in the making, the kind of Euroscepticism which was simmering. I mean, is your view that actually ever since devolution, that's kind of let the cat out of the bag and, you know, support for separatism has been growing since then?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of a sort of short-term problems of the sort that Murdo outlined. I agree with him completely that I think the catalyst for the most recent change in the polls has been perceptions of how the government has handled the COVID-19 pandemic. But there's no escaping, I think, the long-term impact that devolution has had on support for the United Kingdom. You know, I think the European Union example is very telling. The real problem with the European Union, and the reason that the Remain campaign, despite having a lot of advantages and many strong arguments, faced such an uphill struggle, is because of decades of drip blaming of Europe for problems by politicians, and even for voters who don't follow politics very much on a day-to-day level, that sunk in, and it meant it was very difficult. You know, you heard Remain campaigners saying we need to make a positive case for the European Union, but it's very difficult to do that if you've spent 20 years blaming it for various things. And what we've seen from devolution is a similar dynamic. There is a constant on the part of both explicitly separatist nationalists like the SNP in Edinburgh and nominally unionist nationalists like Welsh Labour, there is this dynamic in devolution to constantly obfuscate who's responsible for policy, and then to blame Westminster. And it doesn't matter whether they're, it's Welsh Labour or the SNP, they blame Westminster and they demand more powers, and they keep doing this. And it therefore shouldn't surprise us that 20 years on, an increasing number of Scottish and Welsh voters feel alienated from Britain and from British institutions. And the extent and the solidity of the devolution settlement undermines this further, because it means that actually on a whole range of bread and butter policy issues such as education and health, the union can't act. There's a hospital trust in North Wales that's been under special measures for 6 years. Westminster can't help. And as a result, you end up with this position where, according to the Scotsman, Gordon Brown is proposing to effectively reduce the scope of the British government to foreign affairs and defence and devolve everything else. Most voters aren't particularly invested in foreign affairs and defence. If you can't demonstrate that the British state helps voters on issues that they do care about on a day-to-day basis, you're never going to rebuild support for the union. And attitudes towards devolution, and a particularly inflexible one-way attitude towards devolution, is part of the problem.
Okay, Christine, I mean, do you think, in Westminster, we've had a kind of Tory-led government since 2010. Is there a sort of kind of resentment to kind of English Tories and Boris being the kind of figure ahead of that, which you think might be worsening attitudes in Scotland towards the union?
I think we have seen it before, and I think Murdo probably recognises it as much as I do, in that I was at university through the Thatcher years, and I remember the reaction in Scotland. And I interviewed Ali Buchanan Smith as a young trainee reporter the night of it would have been the 1987 election, when the Scottish Tories took a bit of a beating, and Alex Buchanan Smith laid the blame for that at the door of Margaret Thatcher. And it was exactly the same phenomenon. You had a Conservative government in Westminster which was doing, now whether you think they were the right things which were necessary at the time, or whether you don't, they weren't popular in Scotland. And there were a lot of them which directly affected Scotland. And you had a surge in nationalism through that period, which led to nationalism with a small n, which led to the Constitutional Convention and long-term to devolution. And it came immediately after the 1979 referendum, which had narrowly failed to vote for a parliament. So you can see the trend in history, and it's happening again. And it's all been, Boris Johnson is not popular in Scotland, and that is the nationalists' weapon of choice at the moment, is Boris Johnson's unpopularity. But that will only last as long as Boris Johnson is Prime Minister. And I think that is the case that a lot of us are trying to make at the moment, which is, you don't like Boris Johnson, but that doesn't equate to not liking the United Kingdom. And the argument we have to make is an emotional one, like Murdo says. People now accept that they've seen what happened with Brexit. They see what's happening now with the fishing industry, and they see Scottish independence, if you like, Brexit 2, and what the impact would be in Scotland. And there wasn't anything like the support in Scotland for Brexit that you had in England. So there is a natural antipathy to the impact of Brexit. So the argument is there, and it is an emotional one. It is, look, Scotland can be independent. Of course we can be independent. And if you're prepared and you know what the economic pain would be and you're prepared to take it, that's one argument. But think about the future, and think about what is best for your families, and think about what is best for us and future generations of Scots. It is better to be in the United Kingdom, to have the chance that occasionally you will have a Gordon Brown or a Tony Blair or Alex Douglas Hume. You will have a Scot running the United Kingdom like anybody else. You have, if you look at the number of Chancellors of the Exchequer we've had recently, and the Chief Secretaries to the Treasury, there's something like a decade of Scots. So the influence is there. And the problem that we have in the sort of the drip that you identified is that we haven't fought back. We haven't said, no, I'm sorry, the SNP are talking rubbish. Scots are at the heart of the United Kingdom. Scots are at the heart of the UK government. Scotland is, you know, a major contributor to the UK government. And we have to start making that argument and making it strongly.
So Murdo, just thinking about, you know, who the, you know, the leader of the whole United Kingdom is, how much does that matter to views around separatism? You know, is Boris a really important factor in people's attitudes towards the union? You know, is he more favourable? Is he somebody who's seen as in a less good light than, say, Theresa May or David Cameron?
Yeah, I think you only have to look at the polling evidence that would tell you that that is the case. Now, I mean, Christie makes a very fair point here that, you know, it is an incredibly weak argument for, you know, splitting up a 300-year-old political union, that you don't like the temporary occupant of the office of Prime Minister of the UK. And, you know, I think if that's all that the SNP can build their argument on, then they are in trouble. But it is very convenient for them to latch onto the fact that there's a Prime Minister who doesn't poll well in Scotland. And Nicola Sturgeon at the moment is polling well in Scotland in contrast. I think, you know, this issue of winning the emotional argument is absolutely crucial. You know, the SNP like to portray Scotland as a tolerant, liberal, outward-looking European small nation, in contrast to a caricature that they present of England as a country of, you know, far-right, lager-swilling, racist Brexiteers, you know, Nigel Farage-style pub bores. You know, that's what they want to portray England as. And there is a great narrative that we need to tell, and we've not been telling well enough, about Great Britain as a liberal, tolerant, outward-looking nation. You know, one of the most tolerant nations in Europe, the only nation in Europe that hasn't seen the rise, you know, of the far right as a major political force, that's been incredibly welcoming of immigration from all around the world, that is multicultural and tolerant and open. And, you know, we need to tell that story, and we're not doing it. And
No.
you know, if I hear one more Conservative minister making a speech about our precious union, I'm going to wring his neck or her neck, because nobody in the world, in the real world, knows what our precious union is. What we need to talk about is Britain and being British and what that means. And we're not doing enough of that.
So, I mean, Henry, you know, let's talk about solutions now. So, I mean, we can't just kind of rip everything up and kind of forget about devolution. We are where we are. Yeah. Where do we go from here in terms of institutional reform, you know, kind of the emotional argument to try and keep the union together? What are your solutions?
So forgive me dropping my camera for a second. There was just a moment of very enthusiastic agreement with Murdo, which took me slightly by surprise, because he's completely right that we need to talk about Britain. I think the danger that the government, looking at polling and worried about that, is talking about the union only in a very instrumental sense. You know, you keep hearing Michael Gove talk about our family of nations, or the awesome foursome, is Boris Johnson's phrasing, and ultimately that doesn't work, because all you really do is that you end up describing Britain, the United Kingdom, as a sort of little mini-me European Union. And that's not a sustainable future for the country. In terms of solutions, you're right. You know, nobody is suggesting that we close the Scottish Parliament down straight away. I think that what you need to do is you need to start defending what the European Union's defenders.
Can I make a point?
No, I know. What the European Union's defenders recognised is that they needed to build a case for the European Union based on the fact that the European Union did things, and it did them well. And I think that what we need to do, if we want to build a case for the United Kingdom, is to make the United Kingdom do things that matter to voters, not simply keep agreeing with the SNP that the United Kingdom and the British government should do less and less and less, but it will keep the fiscal transfers going. So, and this can start really small. You know, one thing I suggested this week is that the British government should task the Office for National Statistics with mandating the collection of uniform statistics on public sector performance from across the United Kingdom, because currently Edinburgh, Cardiff, London and Belfast all collect different statistics, which makes comparative assessment of public sector performance very difficult. From there, you've got things like the United Kingdom Internal Market Act, which is increasing the British government's powers to spend additional money in devolved areas, and they can therefore start to demonstrate the utility of the union to people in areas like, hopefully in the future, education and health. It's not a full assault on the devolution settlement, but you do need to start demonstrating that on a day-to-day level, the United Kingdom is not a contract, it's not an alliance, it's not simply a mechanism for the distribution of cash or winning a seat at the UN Security Council. It is a nation, and it is a nation that works when we are governed as that nation, and we pool and share experience as well as risk.
Can I just make the point? If we're talking about independence as a threat, we are talking about the SNP, and we're talking about the argument that the SNP puts forward. And unfortunately, what you just said plays exactly into their hands, because what they are wanting to do, and the argument they are making, is that Scotland could be independent within the European Union. So there has to be a comparison between the United Kingdom and the European Union, because they are both unions. So that is the way forward. Now, the other thing you're forgetting is that the other thing that you're not bearing in mind is that the feeling in Scotland is moving towards, and the emotional argument is taking it there, and the emotional argument is going there, precisely what Murdo talked about in his paper, what Gordon Brown is now talking about, and what the Liberal Democrats have been talking about for 100 years, that the general feeling in Scotland, the popular surge, is towards a devolution settlement, which is more federalist in nature. Now, I realise that that is a different place from perhaps a lot of conservative politicians, or perhaps, you know, people who are not in favour of federalism as it would involve England. But that is the argument that we have at the moment. And if we're going to win the emotional argument, we have to recognise where the vast majority of the population in Scotland is. And while it does not see independence as a top priority, it does see some sort of improvement in the relationship between Holyrood and Westminster as absolutely critical. And that is why we are all recognising it and moving towards a federal argument. And if you try and close it down with arguments about, you know, the internal market bill is hugely unpopular in Scotland. It's not yet been enacted. It's not yet been enacted. The Internal Markets Act, as it will be, the Internal Markets Bill as it is at the moment, is massively unpopular because people see it as a power grab, because it's been portrayed that way. And much and all, as I'm British through and through, I recognise that emotional thing in Scots that Murdo's talking about, which is that you need to appeal to if you're going to avoid independence and us breaking up the UK, what you need to appeal to is that emotional thing in Scots that makes us stand up and cry when we hear something as awful as Flower of Scotland. And what you're suggesting won't do it.
So, Murdo, just to bring in actually, Murdo, I mean, we've seen recent polling actually, which suggests that the kind of emotional case for the union is not that particularly that popular with undecided voters. So, you know, is there a kind of, we're all relying on the emotional rather than the economic case, but maybe that actually won't fly with some voters?
Well, I think if that's the case, it's probably because nobody's making that emotional case.
Yeah.
And, you know, we are, as I said earlier, the polls show we're winning the economic argument, but the identity argument is not there. I sense I'm kind of, you know, holding the jackets here in a fight between Christine and Henry, who are on opposite sides, and I'm kind of in the middle a bit. I agree with some of what Christine said. Incidentally, you know, I think this argument about the internal market bill, nobody in the streets heard of the internal market bill. I mean, the idea that it's hugely unpopular, I think, isn't really borne out.
Unpopular with politicians.
You know, yeah, well, most of whom are nationalists or federalists in Scotland. But amongst the public, are the public in Perth or Edinburgh really concerned who pays for the improvement to the library or museum? Is it the Scottish government or the UK government? I'm not convinced they are. They just want to see it happen. In fact, if there's a competition between governments to see who can spend the most money, I think most people would welcome that. But
I think the thing that they care about, Murdo, I don't think it's that they care. I think it influences them. The European Union was hugely popular in Scotland because there were signs everywhere that said this bridge has been built with money provided by the European Union. This tunnel was built, this whatever. There were signs everywhere which had the European flag on them. People in Scotland did recognise what the European Union did for them. The problem, and I'm maybe alone in the Liberal Democrats in this and saying this, but the problem with the Scottish government is that they put up signs everywhere that have the saltire on it and say this was provided, but they never put up anything that says this was provided by money from the UK government. And that is what we need. So it's not so much that they will care about the internal markets bill, it's that seeing what the UK government does more materially in Scotland is going to be hugely important moving forward, and will help us make that emotional argument.
I think Henry is sort of making that argument. Is that right? You want kind of UK-wide initiatives and institutions. You want to put the UK flag on it.
Precisely. Yeah. The Scottish government isn't going to put the British flag on anything. Ergo, you need things like the UK, like the internal market bill, to empower the British government to spend on bread and butter issues in devolved areas. Now, basically that's what you have to. You've got the balance. You've got, on the one hand, it's going to piss off the Democrats. They're always angry, basically. On the other hand, it does allow you to start getting that drip feed of positive associations with the broader public. And I think there's a deeper problem with this idea of an emotional argument rooted in turning the UK into a sort of mini-me European Union and giving Scotland independence in Britain, which is that you can't really make an emotional argument for something at the top level, and then on the practical level, continually try and stop it doing things. I think this is one of the great tensions in unionist arguments, especially the kind of best of both worlds. You can have all the money and all of the powers arguments that people started trotting out when things got a bit dicey in 2014, which is that they say, Britain is great. We benefit from being part of the United Kingdom. We're British. We're proud to be British. And then you go, oh, okay, well, what parts of our lives should be governed by the United Kingdom? Like, well, not very many. I want more powers for Scotland. If you want to make an emotional case for Britain, that has to go hand in hand with a practical case for Britain. You can't say that you're proud to be British and then continually try and reduce the scope of British governance in day-to-day life. That just can't be done. And so as a result, if you want to make an emotional case, you have to make a practical case. And that means accepting that Britain is more than a European Union. Britain is a union of nations, but it's also a nation in and of itself. And there are millions of people who identify as British and want to be governed as British, and they need to be included too.
Great. I'm going to just bring in some audience members and their questions. So we've got something from J. Peter Wilson, who asks, is there a case of devolution to all regions of all of Britain, from not only London, but also from Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast? So, thinking of devolution, not just in kind of, the kind of four nations, but in terms of the different regions and different local areas. Murdo, is that something that you would have sympathy for?
Yeah, so I think that there's two issues here. There's the English issue, and I think in the paper I wrote for Bright Blue, I did touch on this. I think there's real interest, not in legislative devolution, not setting up parliaments in York and Lancaster, but in actually passing power down from the centre. And we see that in the creation of elected civic mayors in different parts of England. And I think that's welcome. I think people generally want decisions taken closer to where they are. But that also needs to happen in Scotland. And one of the marks of the SNP in government in Scotland has been that while they're very keen for powers to be passed from Westminster to Edinburgh, they are very, very reluctant then for powers to be passed from Edinburgh out to the different parts. And particularly for places further from Edinburgh in Aberdeen in the northeast, there's a real ambition there for more powers to be taken locally, control over economic development, control over the NHS, perhaps even control over welfare, to be taken, not just taken to Edinburgh, actually taken much more locally than that. And that would be, I think, an important counterbalance to this SNP centralising agenda, which is all about hoarding power in Edinburgh.
And Christine, I mean, do you, obviously there's a kind of policy case for devolution, taking power nearer to people and the kind of local areas that they represent, and, having the kind of innovation that comes from decentralization. But what about, decentralizing beyond the nations? Does that kind of help the union argument, if you see what I mean? Is there a kind of pro-unionist argument for devolution beyond Scotland and England to the regions?
This may shock Murdo, but I actually agree with everything you just said. Being a Liberal Democrat. Sorry?
I'm not shocked at all.
Being a Liberal Democrat, we it's part of our sort of genetic makeup that we believe in devolving decision making down to the as close to the community it affects as possible. Whether whatever the issue is. And yeah, I recognise exactly what Murdo's saying. I spent a lot of my life in Aberdeen, and people there would say that they'd be as well ruled from Westminster as Holyrood. There's absolutely no difference, because Westminster isn't actually as centralised as Holyrood is. And it's not just beyond Edinburgh, it's beyond Holyrood. Edinburgh City Council have issues with the lack of, devolution of power from Holyrood to the local authorities. And we're seeing it at the moment in the lack of distribution of the vaccine, the COVID-19 vaccine, and we saw it in broadband. We are way behind, or at least were way behind, where the rollout of the next stage of broadband was in England and Wales, because the procurement process was different. Now that sounds boring, but it is indicative of the centralisation in Scotland, because local authorities had no say in the procurement of the broadband contracts in their areas. It was all done centrally. It was held within Holyrood. So one of the things I actually agree with the government about, Theresa May's government announced that the next tier of broadband in Scotland will be controlled by the local authorities. They were giving power direct to the local authorities to overcome that, because we have more than 90% of the broadband in Scotland is in the central belt, and the areas of the Highlands, which arguably need it most, don't have it. So yes, is the answer. I also think that devolution in England is happening organically. It's one of the things I agree with Gordon Brown about. If you look at the recent row over between Greater Manchester and Westminster about the COVID regulations, that was kind of indicative of the fact that there is now a feeling that their affairs are run by the authority in Greater Manchester. And you're seeing it in London, you're seeing it with mayors all over England. And I think that is the way that our constitution, which has, over hundreds of years, has evolved, is beginning to evolve again. There is an argument, I'm aware, that devolution in Scotland wasn't as much an evolution of the constitution as a decision made but I do think that it was evolving that way, and the Labour government in '97 did the right thing. But I think what's happening in the rest of the UK is an evolution towards a form of devolution.
Okay. I've got another question here, which is anonymous, so hopefully it's not a journalist or the chief whip or anything.
Oh no.
And they say, what about the legal obstacles to actually holding a second referendum? So Henry, just, Nicola Sturgeon might press ahead if she wins this year in Holyrood and say, look, we're going to have this referendum. How strong is the kind of legal defense against that?
So I don't have all of the reading in front of me. I've read cases by lawyers on this, but I'm not myself a lawyer, so I offer this with that caveat. As I understand it, it is almost certain, although there is a court case testing this at the minute, that, the government won't grant a Section 30 order. The government has said it won't. There are lots of excellent arguments for the government not to do it. In 2014, the Section 30 order was what transferred temporarily the power to hold a referendum from Westminster to Edinburgh. So that's not going to happen. So the question then is, can the Scottish government do it without one? The answer, as far as I can see, is almost certainly no. The Constitution is a reserved issue. It is out with the scope of the Scottish Parliament. Therefore, a lot of things would need to go wrong for it to become an issue. The Scottish Parliament would first of all need to admit a bill that was out with its scope, which would be a breach. Then the Scottish government would presumably pass it. Then you would need the active collaboration of the Scottish Civil Service and potentially the Scottish Police with something that would be illegal. You also, and a lot of people make the comparison to Spain and imagine that the question is whether or not Boris Johnson would send in the troops or whatever. You wouldn't need to. As I understand it, under Scottish law, any private citizen could bring a suit against the Scottish government for that illegal exercise of power and then be found against in the Scottish courts. So the only way that you really get to and if there was just an advisory referendum, then unionists would boycott it and that wouldn't be significant. So the only way that you really get to the full-on illegal Catalonia-style wildcat referendum is if the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish courts, the Scottish Civil Service and the Scottish Police all basically decide to back an unlawful referendum. And that is a constitutional crisis, an order of magnitude more serious than I think anybody is contemplating. And I think it's important to say that for all that she needs her activists to believe that the Scottish government's prepared to do whatever it takes. There doesn't seem to be any suggestion that Nicola Sturgeon herself is going to go down the illegal referendum route. Her government's going to test whether or not it has the legal authority, but as far as I can see, there's no suggestion that if they find that they don't, they're actually going to try and hold an illegal referendum. And if they did, the British government should uphold the rule of law, of course.
Okay, so we're coming towards the end of this. So I just think a final question from me, which is, what one thing do you think the UK government, and particularly the UK Prime Minister, can do to try and keep the union together? I realise that one thing that you might say is just get out of the way completely. But in the absence of that, is there anything that the UK Westminster government can do, do you think, which would really make a difference to those undecided voters to keep the union together? Murdo.
Yeah, I mean, I could easily name more than one, but in the interest of brevity, I'll just say this: we actually don't need more flying visits from Boris Johnson. What we need is it becoming unremarkable that the Prime Minister and other UK ministers are in Scotland. And I appreciate we've COVID restrictions, but Scotland is part of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom government has got a reach in Scotland. We need to see much more profile and activity from the UK government in Scotland. And in that respect, I agree with a lot of what Henry said a few minutes ago.
Christine?
Yeah, I think we have to do what we did in 2011, which was take the initiative. We arguably were in a worse position in 2011 than we will be if we, after the elections in May, regardless of what happens, because there was a massive upsurge that we hadn't expected in independence support. And I think then we took the initiative and we said, right, this has to be dealt with. And I actually worked for the coalition in number 10 at that point on this. And I think we have to do what we did then, which was say, it is an issue, we will tackle it. And I think if the UK government makes the mistake of continually saying, no, we're not going to do it, then those within the SNP, and they are a loud voice, and actually, no, it's not Nicola, but I think we're seeing in the SNP at the moment, there is a divergence of opinion on a lot of things. And if the opinion which favours the Catalan approach is the one which wins out at the end of the day, the danger in the UK government saying, no, we're not going to do it, we're not going to do it, we're not going to do it, is that they do go down that route. And then we do have a constitutional crisis. And I think we have to avoid that at all costs. And I think what happens in the next couple of weeks within the Scottish National Party over the various divisions that are evident is crucial to the independence debate. And we have to be prepared for whatever happens, whatever comes out of that. And the UK government must take the initiative, as Murdo says, making it commonplace that the Prime Minister is in Edinburgh on a Wednesday, because of Thursday, because of course he would, because there's always a UK government minister in Edinburgh on a Thursday type approach. That needs to be what we do.
Henry, UK government ministers being in Scotland more, is that going to do it?
I mean, it'll help. I mean, I'd probably take the opposite approach to Christine, and I think the most helpful thing that Boris Johnson could do would be to actually maybe even pass an act placing something in the region of a 20-year moratorium on another referendum. Because you need to buy unionism time to adopt deeper, more longer term strategies rather than this kind of slightly panicky stuff you get whenever they think that a referendum is just around the corner. But second, because sort of on a moral level, as I've explained elsewhere, if you allow the Scottish independence question to be relitigated too frequently, you actually destroy the moral case for the basic functionings of the union. The pooling and sharing of resources, for example, or making major strategic investments in Scotland. If the British government is expected to make decisions which are going to pay out over a 20 or 30-year timescale, they can't reasonably do that and not factor in the fact that Scotland may choose at 5-year intervals to leave. Similarly, if UK taxpayers are to consent to the flow of finances across the internal borders of the United Kingdom, they do that on the assumption that if the economic balance of fortunes changed, then the other side would pay back in as well, and it's a mutual deal. But I think that if your position is, oh well, we'll stay in the union as long as we're net recipients, and although the Scottish nationalists won't concede that, but the moment the economic balance of fortunes changes, we reserve the right to leave, that completely destroys that basis. And I think final point, which is that I think the idea of a Catalan-style showdown is a sort of a figment of excitable journalists' imaginations. But if it did happen, there are 2 points. The first of which is that it wouldn't actually be, I think, good or justified for us to warp our strategy out of shape on the basis of threats of that kind. But the second is, and this is sort of a bluntly tactical point, there's no consent, even amongst the majority of Scots who polls suggest even want a referendum. There's no consent for an extra constitutional approach. And if the SNP did go down that road, it would divide their coalition and we'd win.
Great. Christine, Murdo, Henry, thank you so much for joining us and giving us your thoughts. And thank you everyone at home who's been watching and asking questions. Thank you for joining us on Bright Blue TV. Have a good day.